From Alicia and Ellie, welcome to Composable, a podcast that takes you deep into the tech behind Web3's building blocks.
Every episode, we dive into one key question about how crypto works today and the design space for how it might look in the future.
Composable is an espresso pod, a production of Espresso Systems. All opinions expressed by Composable's hosts and podcast guests are solely their own views. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as investment, legal, or technical advice.
So in the last episode, we went into synchronous versus asynchronous composability. And one takeaway I had from the episode is the idea of a confirmation layer. We need to know for sure if the transaction has been included and will be executed eventually. And there are lots of terms circling the space right now. I've heard pre-confirmations, soft confirmations, fast finality, L1 finality, just a confirmation. So yeah, when did this pre-confirmation term become a thing?
The pre-confirmation term really became popular with based sequencing. Mm-hmm. And that was about, it's been a long time, almost a year ago, that was proposed by Justin Drake. And the idea is that users want a really good user experience, and on Web 2, you can get interactions with websites in milliseconds. So users should be able to get the same thing with rollups or blockchain in general, because otherwise, how are we going to attract all of these users?
Right.
So that was the idea. And pre-confirmations specifically were where one party who is in charge of creating the next block will basically promise a user that they will include their transaction. Okay. And then if the user trusts that, they can say, oh, hey, 100 milliseconds, I have a pre-confirmation, and it's done.
Right.
So that's what a pre-confirmation is, but sometimes people use the word confirmation. So I'd ask you, what is the difference between a confirmation and a pre-confirmation?
Yeah, I think we had to find a way to almost differentiate the terms, right? Because we're all talking about confirmations. And a pre-confirmation, normally there's this perception that it comes from a centralized sequencer. So how can we describe when you have a confirmation that's before L1 finality, so a pre-confirmation, but it comes from something that's more trusted, like a consensus network. And this consensus network needs to be BFT fault tolerant. So I would say a confirmation is akin to a BFT fault tolerant pre-confirmation. So it means that this confirmation is stronger than a pre-confirmation because it comes from this network. And the reason why that makes it stronger is because you have a bunch of nodes, hopefully decentralized geographically, and they are agreeing that this is the transaction that will be included based on the ordering that they see. So that is how I see a confirmation versus a pre-confirmation.
I'm wondering if maybe we could also define it as on the transaction level versus the block level. So a pre-confirmation is generally done to a single transaction per user.
Right.
And then a confirmation is generally done on a whole roll-up block.
Right.
So that's another small difference.
Interesting.
Okay, but now there's this term the Arbitrum uses called a soft confirmation. And what is that? In
my opinion, I think a soft confirmation is a pre-confirmation that comes from their centralized sequencer. I see no difference between a soft confirmation and a pre-confirmation. So I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I 100% agree.
Okay.
It's the same thing. But the thing is, though, is that these pre-confirmations and confirmations have become such a big part of not only the discourse around new things being built, but just actual user experiences. For example, if you go and do something in your wallet, a lot of the times it will tell you that it's been confirmed or it's succeeded before Ethereum finality. Exactly. So this is a form of a pre-confirmation. So yeah, maybe now we can dive into how pre-confirmations exist today and how they're being used.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I really resonate with that point that you made that right now the experience for the user is getting this confirmation from their wallet. And I remember when I joined Espresso, actually, that was one almost gotcha. I had to remind myself, I was like, wait a second, the blockchain experiences we've been having and appreciating, we really have not been thinking about the fact that L1 finality is actually around 12 to 15 minutes. You should be waiting for that transaction to be properly confirmed or become final. And I really love that I now appreciate this nuance because then it helps me understand trust assumptions with various protocols. Now I understand more the risk of using layer 2s and when you know that your transaction is confirmed. I just wanted to add that point because I think everyone in this space definitely interacts with pre-confirmations and trusts pre-confirmations like finality. I've never heard one person say, oh no, I'm waiting 15 minutes before I can tell you that this transaction is confirmed. Mm-hmm. And even like when you send crypto to exchanges, for example, sometimes they take a long time and I'm like, man, why are they taking a long time? And they're waiting for L1
They're
penalty.
waiting for
Yeah, they're like, I need to get my money.
So now let's maybe talk about the flow from a pre-confirmation to finality.
Yeah.
So it starts out with some sort of a pre-confirmation, which is generally given by a single party. It can be a centralized sequencer, but it could also be something else. Mm-hmm. And then you move on to the confirmation, which is much stronger, but it might take you a little bit longer to get. So a pre-confirmation can generally be received by a user within a couple hundred milliseconds, just like loading a website. Right. Whereas a confirmation might take you a little bit longer. It might take you a couple of seconds, but it's a lot stronger of a guarantee. And then finally, if you can wait all the way for Ethereum finality, then you know for sure that your transaction will succeed. Yes. The interesting thing, though, is when it comes to interoperability, pre-confirmations play an important role, actually, because if you had to wait to go through the L1 for every single asynchronous transaction, that's not a great user experience. Yeah. So maybe you can talk about how things like solvers or relays might use pre-confirmations to give better UX to users.
Yeah, that's a really good point. If you were to use a bridge like a Polygon bridge today, a transaction would take about 15 minutes to be completed because they are waiting for that L1 penalty. They have to take the assets from the rollup onto L1. L1 gives a penalty, and that's how you're able to bridge. And when you look at other websites, like let's say a cross protocol or relay, they're both bridges using like a relay or solver network. They talk about the fact that you can get your transactions or your withdrawals or your bridging happening in a very short space of time, shorter than definitely 15 minutes. And I think the way that they're able to do that is because their relayers are trusting some level of pre-confirmation as well. So yeah, I do agree with you. Like pre-confirmations are definitely important for composable experiences and making it faster. And even though these protocols are offering you asynchronous composable experiences, it's because the relayers can be faster, but it's because they're trusting a pre-confirmation. It would massively improve the experience of a relayer and a user if the relayer is able to get a pre-confirmation that they can trust.
All right, I have a little bit of a spicy question for you.
Yeah.
So we talk about centralized sequencers, and they're bad because they're centralized and they're single party and they could totally screw over users.
Right.
And so we want this decentralized sequencing, maybe pre-confirmations where you rotate the sequencer or they can be slashed for money.
Yeah.
So my spicy question is, we tend to think that decentralized pre-confirmations would be better, but the Arbitrum sequencer has never equivocated, ever. So It actually has a very strong reputation compared to maybe a decentralized protocol where the participants are more anonymous and maybe they would more likely try to do something malicious. So what do you think? Are centralized sequencers really that bad?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I remember spending some time just really looking into understanding what are some bad things that have happened with centralized sequencers. And the worst thing I've seen, and these are from players like Arbitrum and Optimism, so obviously very well respected, is the fact that maybe sometimes the sequencer goes down. And that's the worst thing that I've seen. And it just means that, we now have a blip where for the next 2 hours, no transactions are being processed. So I can see how centralized pre-confirmations or centralized sequencers can be trusted to some degree. And these relays and these protocols clearly are proving that because it's most likely what they are using. But I still think it's better that we know for sure that this came from like a trusted system. This is what we are building in the blockchain space for. Otherwise, we're just trending closer to Web 2. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think it would be more advantageous to make sure that the confirmation is stronger and final. There's more to pre-confirmation than just the confirmation. There is the ordering of transactions as well that goes in, which is the thing that they're confirming. Mm-hmm. They're confirming the transactions. As far as I know, there's no way to see exactly how these transactions are being ordered or if there are any guarantees about how they're ordered and if there's any kind of value extraction in that process.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really tough. I think it does go so much deeper when you peel back the layers. So yes, I do think Optimism or Arbitrum, they have a really strong reputation, and I don't think they'll ever equivocate on users. But I do think that there's still value to having a decentralized network for other reasons. Maybe we just trust pre-confirmation forever, and that's how we do it. But you can think of smaller rollups. Maybe they stand up their own sequencer. Do we want to trust them? Right. They don't have the same reputation in backing them. And this also gets into interoperability a bit, because if you're interoperating between two chains, you ideally want a pre-confirmation on both chains.
Yeah.
And that can get, maybe it's easier to coordinate that if you have some sort of like decentralized network or shared sequencer network versus just hoping your transactions get in on both chains.
I love that so much. Those are both really strong points. The first point you made about the fact that if you are a smaller roll-up and now you have a centralized sequencer, it means that no one would trust you because you haven't built that credibility. Mm-hmm. So in the end, we actually just end up with a system of monopolies and we stifle innovation that way. Mm-hmm. So with the products, like with decentralized sequencing products, they can help smaller roll-ups still have the same respect and still have the same opportunities as the big roll-ups, like Optimism and Arbitrum.
Yeah.
And then the second point you were making, you have to know that you can trust both sequencers with the same level of confidence if you're interacting between two chains.
Maybe diving a little bit deeper into the interoperability part. Mm-hmm. So, in my opinion, there's two ways that interoperability can affect pre-confirmations. Mm-hmm. So, you can have an inclusion pre-confirmation, and that's really useful to a lot of users. But the most ideal pre-confirmation is perhaps an execution pre-confirmation, where you know the exact outcome of your trade.
Yeah.
And to do that within two interoperable chains, you need a shared sequencer. And if you don't have a shared sequencer, you can't get an execution pre-confirmation because they don't know what the state of the block is until you actually combine the two blocks.
Yeah.
I'm curious if in the future execution pre-confs will be very in demand and that maybe will this push chains to have shared sequencing? Will this be like, oh, my users want an execution pre-conf, and so maybe I will agree to share a sequencer with another rollup, or maybe do you think that rollups will just not share sequencers even if they could get these really great pre-confs to give their users?
It depends on the philosophy of said rollup.
Yeah, that's true.
And how sovereign they want to be. Mm-hmm. But I could imagine just the concept of wanting synchronous composability would really push forward that requirement, because if there is no need for it, if asynchronous composability is solving it well enough, then there wouldn't necessarily be a need to have a shared sequencer or a shared confirmation layer. So yeah, it depends on how that grows, how the desire for that grows. And also, if you are running a shared sequencer, I could imagine the hardware requirements for that to be quite a lot, because now you have to be able to know what's happening on one chain and the other chain, receiving all these transactions and being able to execute it so you know the state of each chain and then the state of the user accounts across these chains. So yeah, it depends on if we're really going to have a synchronous composable future.
Well, I like the point you brought up, though, about the hardware to run these. So we want this decentralized pre-confirmations, but in reality, running a pre-confirmer, it requires sophistication. Yeah. So you have to be able to execute blocks, and if you're doing it for more than one rollup, you have to be able to execute all of those rollups blocks if you're the sequencer.
Right.
But you also have to have some infrastructure to protect from denial of service attacks. People are going to spam you with invalid transactions. This is all expensive infrastructure that you have to run. Maybe what I'm thinking is, let's say we do have a world where we have decentralized pre-confirmations. Is this going to end up in the same place PBS is today, where you really just have three big players who do it, and maybe is that much better than just a single centralized sequencer?
My POV right now is that is potentially possible or likely. And the reason why I say that is that you have to be incentivized to want to do this kind of operations. If you would like to sequence for multiple blockchains and have to deal with the hardware requirements for that, then it must be because you're earning something. And to be able to be in the top earners, you probably would have the most sophisticated algorithms for ordering, the most sophisticated tech stack, and not everyone can get to that point. So I think it would trend into that. And is that a bad thing? Or we'll see when that time comes, if it does lead to anything catastrophic. But it's of my opinion right now that it would trend to that. What about you?
I can see that happening as well.
Yeah.
Particularly for execution pre-confs, because inclusion pre-confs are pretty easy. Execution pre-confs are what requires a sophistication. But then you go down the rabbit hole of MEV. Optimism and Arbitrum promise to be altruistic and they're not going to front run you. Yeah. But if you have some other sort of sequencer, how do they decide whether to take your pre-confirmation and say that it'll guarantee to execute, or wait and maybe they can put it behind some other transactions and gain more MEV?
Interesting.
And so the outcome of this is that will pre-confirmations end up just being too expensive? Because presumably if a user gets a pre-confirmation, they need to pay a fee that is equivalent to the MEV that builder could have earned if they didn't pre-conf it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think this is a tough question. I think in the future, in my opinion, inclusion pre-confs will be very important. I don't think they're getting a lot of attention right now, but they'll be cheap. They're so cheap. There's no penalty to include them because you can put them anywhere in the block. Right. I think execution pre-confs are going to be a little bit pricey. Okay. And I'm not sure if they'll be something that the regular user it'll be worth it for them to pay that price.
Yes, I can agree with this, and I have so many thoughts, especially around MEV. If I think about the users that would care most about proper synchronous composable experience, would care most to pay for having that inclusion and execution guarantee, it's probably somebody who's extracting value. I can agree with that point that atomic inclusion probably can get us very far and would be probably the more popular option. But just because it is the more popular option, it might not mean that it will be the only thing that will exist. Because at the end of the day, all these companies have to make money. Mm-hmm. And even if the bulk of users prefer atomic inclusion, if they can generate a lot of revenue by having atomic execution, I believe they will put the resources behind building it. Mm-hmm. And I think about that when we think about sequencers at rollups as well. Like, they can make money from sequencing. And then we have the builders who can find ways to make even more money through ordering the transactions. And the real reason why they might be willing to sequence for another L2 is the fact that they can make money from it. So we can't ignore the fact that value creation and value capture is a lot of the incentive of what we build in Web3.
Yes, that's a really good point. I'm curious too, when I think about it, there's things like Flashbots Protect, which is an endpoint that is supposed to protect you from a little bit of MEV. Right. So in a way, I'm wondering what kind of pre-confirmations will become popular. Will users really care about not being front-run? Or will they be able to not take as hard of a stance and maybe they'll use something like Flashbots Protect on different forms? Or will they be completely fine with all sequencer front-running them completely and taking as much MEV as possible? And I think that for an average user, that's really hard to decide because I don't actually know how much MEV my transaction is worth.
Yeah. So if there was a dashboard, maybe some people would care. If you saw a dashboard that showed your history of transactions over time, and it shows how much MEV was extracted from your transaction, I've never had a conversation with anyone who's like, damn, these MEVers are taking my value. You just carry on. Like, you set your slippage allowance. If the transaction doesn't succeed, it fails. I think probably that is where users complain more.
No, you're completely right about that. I remember back when Ethereum was having terribly high fees and I was submitting Uniswap transactions and they failed and they were really expensive and it was really frustrating to me as a user.
Yeah, for sure. So I wonder now, do you think users would care about pre-confirmations too?
I think in reality, I don't think they really care about the trust assumptions. Like, the trust assumptions are really important, but for an average user, I think that they'd be fine with a centralized sequencer pre-confirmation. Yeah. And in reality, it would be very rare that pre-confirmation would be broken. So this is kind of a difficult thing. A lot of Web3 is about trustlessness and decentralization, and it's specifically for the case that almost never happens, but if it does, it's catastrophic. I think that that's a very important thing to build for, but perhaps financial companies or whatever, they'll say, hey, I'll take the risk and I'll just allow this pre-confirmation to go through, and if something happens, I'll just absorb it into my funds.
Yeah, you're right. As we continue to abstract and we create systems that make it seem like you're not using the blockchain, I think now more than ever, we have to ensure that the blockchain infrastructure is secure and robust. So whilst the user may not care about pre-confirmation, I do think us as developers and protocols, we have to continue ensuring that we have safety around all the elements. And I love the pre-confirmation conversation as well, because even though it wasn't something that was focused on before, it definitely revealed the fact that there's so many layers of trust that we have to work through to make sure that everything works. So before, I was trusting rollups blindly. I didn't realize that pre-confirmations were a thing and they had a centralized sequencer. I was so baffled when I learned that. And I consider myself to be a Web3 or crypto native. Yeah. So yeah, definitely being able to distinguish between the type of pre-confirmations is important for the people who are making these technical decisions at companies.
I want to dig into about all of these different trust assumptions. I think this is something that makes pre-confirmations difficult, is because there are just so many different levels of them. So you could have trusting a pre-confirmation from a centralized sequencer. Maybe that's the most trusting. but what if we put the sequencer in a TEE? Mm-hmm. Well, maybe we trust it more, but do we trust it more than a decentralized network? This is a very hot topic if we want to trust TEEs.
Yeah.
And then you go a layer further and you say, okay, I'm going to wait for a confirmation from some sort of a confirmation network. And that's great, but it's still not Ethereum finality. And I think a lot of this just comes down to how much trust do we want to have? And specifically, how do we even figure out how we think trust works?
Yeah.
I might trust a TEE more than someone else, and it's different. It's hard because everybody has different values of these trust assumptions.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Web3 was meant to be zero trust, and now we're like, hold up. We actually have a lot of trust assumptions, and we need to be very explicit about them.
Mm-hmm.
And even the TEE one, like I'm hearing about this so much now, is put everything in a TEE.
Mm-hmm.
Like, TEE all the things.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm still trying to figure out, okay, TEEs, are they secure? I understand that you use secure hardware, but now you're trusting the hardware.
Yeah.
Like, you're still adding a trusted layer.
Mm-hmm. There's also, I think, a level of like reputation trust.
Yeah.
Because running a sequencer who's giving pre-confirmations, like I said earlier, people are going to try to attack you.
Yeah.
And I think even if you're a really altruistic sequencer, you also still run the risk that someone is going to find a way to hack you. Like there is some bug that allows remote code execution, and then they get on your sequencer and they just do terrible, terrible things. And this is another one of those risks that's so minimal if you have a reputable person running a sequencer, but it is possible, and if it happened, it would be catastrophic.
Yeah. So do you know if there's anything right now that's live that's offering you more of like a hard confirmation? So it's like the interim between finality and pre-confirmations. Does that exist yet?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's a lot of projects who are working on this. I suppose you could consider Astria. Mm-hmm. They went live on mainnet pretty recently.
Right.
Yeah, they'd be kind of like a confirmation layer or a hard confirmation, as Arbitrum puts it.
Yeah. Okay. And what about Espresso? Like, when are they going to be mainnet?
Yeah. Well, maybe by the time this is out, Espresso will be mainnet.
Okay, good. Because is Astria in the EVM's ecosystem?
They're more focused on the Celestia or the Cosmos ecosystem.
Okay. Oh my gosh. Is pre-confirmations from a DA layer a thing?
They can be. Oh, that's a really good point. So Arbitrum recently came out with this fast withdrawals, and they use the AnyTrust DA committee. So basically, if you're using AnyTrust, you use a committee of however many nodes to keep your data available, and you don't trust Ethereum to do that. And you have, it's cheaper, a lot of benefits. But you also have the risk, it's not Ethereum for your DA. So what Arbitrum did was add this extra layer that says, hey, you're already trusting these DA nodes anyway for the safety of your data. So you might as well just have them execute, and then they can give you a fast pre-confirmation. And so I think that this is a really neat way to tie in DA layers. So if you're using Ethereum for DA, this doesn't really make sense. But if you're using anything else for DA, you already have to trust them for DA. So if you're going to trust them anyway, why not maybe give them a little bit of an extra job?
Yeah, I love that. I did see this fast withdrawals on Arbitrum's website, and I thought it was really smart. And one thing that stuck out to me is that they said if you are a chain, so you're an L3 on Arbitrum, and you're not using Ethereum as your DA layer, you're no longer considered a roll-up. Mm-hmm. First question, is it that deep?
Is it? Oh, that's a spicy question. It depends on who you ask. Some people feel very strongly that roll-ups and validiums are very separate things. Okay. I have to be honest with myself. I don't really think the distinction is that important, and we should just call them all roll-ups.
Right. Okay. I think I appreciate that sentiment because Ethereum right now is seen as like the most secure blockchain. It's been alive for so long, and everything is fine. So if you were to create another blockchain, you have your own consensus layer. So for example, Arbitrum, right? They have their own blockchain, they have their own validators, but they haven't been running for as long, and they're not Ethereum. So now if you have an L3 built on top of Arbitrum that's using this other consensus network that's not Ethereum, yes, I do trust that their consensus mechanism will work majority of the time, but I still need to see it proved out. Yeah. So unless it's a DA layer that has been around for a while and has consistently proved it out, until then, would I feel ready to call it a roll-up? Mm. So I think I probably match the sentiment of if you're not using Ethereum for DA, you are not a roll-up.
Okay.
Okay, so we mentioned that we have pre-confirmations. aka soft confirmations, then we have just confirmations, and then we have L1 finality. And there is this concept about using L1 validators for sequencing. And if you do use L1 for sequencing, then you are considered a based rollup. So you're not just any rollup, you're now a based rollup.
Yeah.
How does that change preconfirmations? If you are a based rollup and L1 validators are being used for sequencing, does that make the preconfirmation stronger in any way?
It's a good question. I think it depends on how the preconfirmation is designed. So if you're using a preconfirmation, even for base sequencing, if it comes from a centralized party, you have the same guarantees as any centralized sequencer. But I think the key difference with base sequencing is that you could theoretically settle every single Ethereum block. So maybe it's not that bad for users to wait for finality. So maybe you get a preconfirmation and you say, okay, yes, I'm going to use this, but finality is like really, well, Ethereum finality is not close, but if your transaction's a couple blocks deep, you're pretty sure.
Right.
And I think that this is different from rollups that do not settle very often. And maybe this is a really good reason for these fast confirmation layers, because you get a fast pre-confirmation, but you won't know it's final until maybe several hours, depending on the rollup. So getting a really strong fast pre-confirmation or confirmation within a couple of seconds is like, it's very powerful. So you don't have to wait the 3 hours.
Yeah. Okay. So now we have base pre-confirmations, another term.
Yeah, this is a lot of opinions about this. In my opinion, based pre-confirmations are no different than any other kind of pre-confirmations. It's just that they're used by base rollups. So I'm of the opinion that it's kind of a misnomer.
Interesting. Go, because if a pre-confirmation comes from a centralized sequencer, why would you say that a base pre-confirmation is like any other pre-confirmation? If we use that definition.
I think that based pre-confirmations can be implemented a few different ways, some of which maybe by the time this comes out will be live on mainnet.
Okay.
But in an ideal world, it would be the L1 proposer giving you a pre-confirmation.
Right.
But just like PBS today, the L1 proposer probably isn't going to want to do all of that work. So really, it's going to be the builder or something like a builder giving you a pre-confirmation. And that's pretty centralized. So maybe you go from a single centralized sequencer to a set of 5 decentralized pre-confirmers. Yeah, so I think that's why it can be very similar.
Okay, I see that and I appreciate that, but I still would give it like a little bit of a higher rating in terms of, like, if we were to read centralized sequences giving pre-confirmations as a 0, then I would give that like a 2. And then a confirmation like a 5. And then L1 finality like 10.
Yeah, the best case scenario would be that if the L1 proposers just gave the pre-conf themselves, which I think is a lot more doable for inclusion pre-confs. You still need to protect yourself from spam and things like that, but you're not having to do any fancy execution or price evaluation. So maybe it's a lot more realistic for L1 proposers to do inclusion pre-confs.
Okay, I think that makes a lot of sense.
So my question to everybody out there is, what kind of trust assumptions are you okay with? Do you just always trust a roll-up centralized sequencer pre-confirmation, which is fine? Or are you someone that really does wait for Ethereum finality? If you are, I would love to meet you because you might be the only person that exists. Yeah. How does a person decide how much I want to trust this different pre-confirmation? It's kind of screws with your mind a little bit. But yeah, I'd love to hear from everybody about what they think these trust assumptions should be and how we should evaluate them. Hey, this is Ellie and Alicia. Thank you for joining us on another episode of Composable. We love hearing from you, so please hit us up on Twitter @ComposablePod, send us feedback, and join the conversation.
Our episodes go live every 2 weeks at 7 a.m. Eastern Time, so make sure you like and subscribe so you never miss an update, and you can even enjoy with your morning coffee. Share it with your friends and fellow builders.
We'll see you next time on Composable.